Hey there. Ready for a deep dive into Stoicism? It's one of those things that sounds kind of, I don't know, stiff maybe when you first hear about it, right? Like just keeping a stiff upper lip no matter what.
Right.
But there's so much more to it than that. We're going to get into what this ancient philosophy is really all about and how it can actually be super useful in your life today.
And it's amazing how relevant Stoicism still is. I mean, we're talking about ideas that are centuries old, but that focus on what we can control. Building resilience, learning to kind of be in harmony with nature. It's powerful stuff.
Absolutely. So where do we even start with this deep dive? What's the source material telling us about the core of Stoicism?
Well, it jumps right into these key principles, these really important ideas, like this idea of living in agreement with nature.
Okay, living in agreement with nature. Help me wrap my head around that one.
So think about it this way. Okay, imagine you're stuck in traffic.
Ugh, the worst.
The worst, right. Now, a Stoic approach, it isn't about getting all angry and like honking the horn and stressing out. It's about maybe accepting the situation for what it is. Maybe using that time to listen to a podcast or finally calling your mom back,
Right.
Recognizing that you can't actually control the traffic.
Right. It is what it is.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's about focusing on what you can control, which is, like you said, maybe how you use that time, what your reaction is in that moment.
Exactly. That's a really key distinction. The Stoics were all about this thing they called the dichotomy of control, which sounds way more complicated than it is. Basically, it's just being really clear on what you can and can't control. They believed that was really the key to navigating all the ups and downs, all the curveballs that life throws at us.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So it's not about being passive. It's about being smart about where you direct your energy. The source material also mentions some really big names in Stoicism, Epictetus, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius. These weren't just like philosophers hanging out in ivory towers. These were people who really lived this stuff.
Yeah, and they didn't have easy lives either. Like, take Epictetus, for example. He was a slave. Can you imagine?
Wow.
Yeah, and he eventually found freedom through philosophy. He really emphasized the importance of controlling your reactions to events, no matter how difficult or unfair they might seem.
Wow. Talk about walking the walk.
Yeah.
And Seneca, wasn't he a politician?
He was, yeah, and a writer, too. Seneca, he was all about self-awareness, really understanding yourself, and authenticity, living in line with your true nature. He believed that external factors couldn't shake you if you were true to yourself.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, and then there's Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor. Talk about pressure.
Right. Can you imagine leading an entire empire and still trying to live by these Stoic principles? His writings are really interesting because they're full of these reflections on embracing your roles and responsibilities, even when they feel really heavy. And you can really see him in his writing constantly reminding himself, focus on what you can control. Focus on your own actions, your own judgments, even when it seems like the world around him is kind of chaotic, which, ruling an empire probably felt pretty chaotic a lot of the time.
That's incredible. It's just amazing to me how these guys from centuries ago still feel so relevant today.
It's because their insights, their understanding of virtue and acceptance and using reason, those are timeless qualities that are so powerful, especially when it comes to navigating our world, which is, let's face it, pretty complex.
Absolutely. So we've got a good foundation now on some of those core Stoic principles, but what I'm really curious about is how do we actually put this stuff into practice in our daily lives?
Yeah, good question. And the source material actually gets into that, into some specific exercises that the Stoics recommended. And honestly, you might be surprised at how relevant they still are today, how much they sound like things you might hear about in modern therapy. So, are you ready for this? The first exercise is something called negative visualization.
Negative visualization. That doesn't sound super pleasant. Like, am I trying to attract bad vibes or something?
Not at all. It's not about attracting negativity. It's more about kind of like mentally preparing for it. The Stoics, they believed that by actually picturing those potential setbacks, those challenges, those difficulties, that could actually make their impact less intense if and when they did happen.
Oh, interesting. So it's almost like you're pre-living those challenges as a way to build up some resilience.
Exactly. Exactly. Think of it like mental strength training, right? If you face those fears head on, even if it's just in your mind, you're sort of taking away their power a little bit.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's not about ignoring problems or pretending they won't happen. It's more like confronting them in this controlled way.
Right, and it really ties back to that whole dichotomy of control we were talking about. You're acknowledging that you can't always control what happens to you, but you can control how you react to it.
Right. Okay, that's really interesting. So what about other practical things the Stoics recommended?
So they were really big on mindfulness and reflection.
Okay, mindfulness. Everybody's talking about mindfulness these days.
Right, and for good reason. It's such a useful practice. And for the Stoics, it was all about trying to align your actions with virtue, like really living in accordance with your values.
Gotcha.
And to do that, to live that way, you need a lot of self-awareness, right? You need to know what's going on in your own head. So mindfulness in this context, it's about being present, being in the moment, and really paying attention to your thoughts and feelings. And the key is to do that without judgment.
Oh, so you're not beating yourself up for having certain thoughts, you're just observing them.
Exactly, just noticing them. And that's where the reflection part comes in. It's like, okay, now that you're aware of those thoughts and feelings, now you can start to analyze them. Were your actions lining up with your values? Is there something you could do differently next time? It's like this constant process of self-improvement.
Wow, it's fascinating to me how much these ancient practices, these things the Stoics were doing thousands of years ago, how relevant they still are today. It's like they were way ahead of their time.
I know, right? It's like they tapped into something really fundamental about the human experience, you know? Like they were dealing with things like loss and anxiety and pressure and all that stuff, just like we are today.
Totally. Okay, so we've got negative visualization, we've got mindfulness, reflection. Anything else in the source material about how to actually put these Stoic principles into practice?
There is one more, and this one might really surprise you. It's called voluntary discomfort.
Voluntary discomfort. Okay, I thought we were done with the intense stuff. You're messing with me. That sounds like, I don't know, kind of the opposite of all that self-care everyone's always talking about.
I know, right? Sounds a little counterintuitive, but trust me, the Stoics were onto something with this one. They believed that by actually choosing to experience some discomfort sometimes and doing it in this really intentional, controlled way, it could actually help you build resilience.
Okay, interesting. So how does that actually work?
Well, think about it this way. When you intentionally put yourself in slightly uncomfortable situations, you start to realize that you're much stronger than you give yourself credit for, you know?
Okay, yeah.
You start to shift your perspective on what you thought was difficult. And then when bigger challenges inevitably come up, you're more ready to face them head on because you've already been through that discomfort and you realize it wasn't so bad.
Okay, that makes sense. So are we talking about taking cold showers or, I don't know, fasting for a bit? What counts as voluntary discomfort?
Yeah, exactly. Things like that. Things that kind of push you out of your comfort zone a bit, you know?
Right.
Show you that you're capable of handling more than you think. The Stoics, they were really serious about this stuff. They'd sleep on the floor on purpose sometimes, or fast, or even go stand out in the elements.
Wow, okay. I can see how after doing stuff like that, you'd really appreciate a warm bed.
Right.
But, it's a really interesting concept, right? Because, especially today, we live in a world that is so obsessed with comfort and convenience.
Right, yeah.
Maybe a little bit of that voluntary discomfort is actually, exactly what we need to, build up that mental resilience, that perspective.
I think so. And I think that's what the Stoics were getting at. It's not about making yourself miserable, but it's about challenging your ideas about what's comfortable and realizing that discomfort, it's a natural part of life.
Right.
You know, it's how we respond to it, how we approach it that matters.
That is such a good point. This has been, honestly, such a fascinating deep dive. We've covered so much ground, even just wrapping our heads around those core Stoic principles, those big ideas like living in agreement with nature, that dichotomy of control, and then all these practical exercises, negative visualization, mindfulness, reflection, voluntary discomfort.
And don't forget about virtue. That's really the foundation of all of it.
Right.
The Stoics really believed that if we can just work on ourselves, and try to live by those virtues, things like wisdom, justice, courage, temperance, that's how we can start to live more fulfilling and meaningful lives.
It all comes back to virtue. It's amazing how, again, these ideas that are literally from centuries ago are still so relevant, so helpful for us today.
It really speaks to, I think, the timelessness of this ancient philosophy. It's really like a set of tools for life, like how to navigate the challenges, how to find some inner peace, how to like actually become the best version of yourself.
That's a great way to put it. So if this deep dive has like really piqued your interest, if you're like, okay, I need more of this Stoicism stuff, I highly recommend checking out some of those original Stoic texts we mentioned.
Yeah, definitely.
There is so much wisdom packed into those writings, and maybe even try out one of those exercises we talked about. See what you think.
Yeah.
Until next time.